I'd like to welcome not just everybody in the hall, but everybody who is on the live streaming today, and we welcome your participation in the conference. Because of that, just a few small parts of housekeeping. You'll be aware that the session, as I say, is live streamed and will then be recorded and made available on the IFLA website. If you are uncomfortable with being recorded or have not signed the filming permission, if you move to the area on the my right, your left, behind the camera, that area will not be covered by the filming. We have 4 speakers today, and I would ask you to keep all your questions until the end of the session, although those of you who are online are actually able to submit questions at any point of the session today, but we will be dealing with all the questions at the end of today's session. Our session today is entitled Intellectual Freedom in a Polarized World, and I'm sure you're aware that life and views and expressions are polarized right across the world today. Citizens can be seen to be either with the government or against it. They can be seen to be with partisan views or against partisan views. And that can sometimes seem to leave little opportunity to freely and safely express more nuanced views or challenging views of current social, political, or economic issues. IFLA's Freedom of Access to Information and Freedom of Expression Advisory Committee is going to explore this phenomenon today and the potential role of civil society and information professionals in advancing freedom of expression through the experience and insights of NGO leaders, an academic, public intellectual, and an officer of UNESCO. And I'd like you to welcome our first speaker today, talking about internet and the freedom of expression in Indonesia, opportunity and challenges, Indira DS. Welcome.
Hello. First of all, before I start my presentations, I would like to extend my gratitude to IFLA for giving me a chance to share my insight on the recent development in regard to internet freedom in Indonesia, and particularly to Brandrew that make it possible for me to fly from Sydney, where I'm based now, because I'm taking my PhD study at the UNSW Law School now. To fly here and to share some of the insight that I've got throughout my years in working in internet freedoms and human rights back home, to give you a sight on the recent development taking place in Indonesia. So I give the title of my presentations, Internet Freedom of Expression in Indonesia, Challenges and Opportunity, and my presentations will be divided into 3 parts. First, I would like to introduce general overview on the context of Indonesia in regard to internet and internet adoptions, and then more into a detail about statistics. So to give you more for those who are not familiar with Indonesia, it will give you a good snapshot of the numbers, total populations, the level of internet penetrations, and other information related to that, and how it changed the flow of information within the Indonesia and throughout the border of Indonesia. And after that, I'm start look into some of the opportunity that we see from those development, and move into some of the challenges that we are facing at the moment. And before I start with that, I will also give a snapshot of a regulatory framework that govern freedom of expressions in Indonesia, because above all, it's actually a constitutional right in Indonesia. So I'm just going to start with the first informations about how could we see and what do we see in the context of rapid internet penetrations in Indonesia. It's not only, it's only since early 2000s and after 2007 that internet penetrations is rapidly growing, and also thanks to the massive and cheap availability of smartphone technology. So after that, we see that the numbers of internet users are steadily increased, and then it's also influence the rapid information transfer and information flow among the people and internet users back home. But also we're still facing some of the basic problem in regard to internet infrastructures, as well as the disparity of access, because based on the observations, most of internet users are located at the western part of Indonesia and left behind some disadvantageous places at the eastern part of the country in which the infrastructure is lack of. And then this growing internet penetrations also followed by what I call as noise and voice, a continuous contestations where internet become a new arena of battle among different groups of people within the society, try to voice out some of their concern, but try to also make a noise. So it continuously becoming an arena politically and socially for Indonesian society to compete each other, to influence government policy as well as democratization process back home. And move into a more statistical figures of internet and how it influenced Indonesian people, we can see that now internet penetrations have been more than 50% of total populations. Indonesia population is 240 million. So it's now 140 million people are going online. And then as you see that the age of those who are going online are getting younger and younger. It may, to a certain extent, pose a different challenges when we talk about challenges at the different part of these presentations. And looking at the figures I collected from different sources that try to go into deeper on the possibilities coming up from the rapid penetrations of internet back home, it is very clear that internet in one side is a promising because it's also relates to the increase of e-commerce growth. Like it's projected that it's going to be like 205 million user by 2020, which actually will have a value around, if I'm not mistaken, something 46 billion e-commerce market, and will be the biggest market in ASEAN regions. So all in all, it also gives a significance why internet is always important and how it relates to the right of the people in regard to freedom of expression and informations. Now I move into legal and constitutional framework that governing the protections of internet as a human right. So if we look at the Indonesian's legal structures, we see that obviously the internet is a constitutional right, and we have some laws that also implementing that constitutional right, and further move into a more technical regulations that go into a more detail talking about and governing about internet critical infrastructure up to range from internet critical infrastructure to content of the internet or information transmitted online. So in regard to this, one of the notes that I would like to put forward is in the context of Indonesia, it is very unfortunate that though law is there and there is a constitutional guarantee in regard to the right of freedom for informations and expressions, it may not always be in the practice. So there is a gap in between the normative protections of right and the implementation and the enforcement of right. And if you look at this picture, it just to give you an idea that it's in line with the rapid development of the internet, that the government tried to produce more regulations only after 2007. up to 2018. And if you look closely into that, we have more technical regulations rather than, in terms of law. So, and you also notice that, for example, in terms of the protection of privacy, up to now and data protections, personal data protections, we are now regulated by technical regulation rather than law, which is, if we look at from the human right perspective, it may not be adequate to the global standard of human right protection in this field. So from what I've learned in observing the internet penetration and how it influenced the society, I also see that we have a good side of it as well as bad side of it. First is about civic empowerment. It is true that internet has created momentum as well as opportunity to develop what we call combining online and offline social mobilizations among the society, both to promote democratization process as well as to promote stronger accountability in regard to public policies. I give you some of the example, I will not go down to it, but that's the real example, and more internet users are aware of these potentials, and more ad hoc social mobilization are there, utilizing the internet and combining with social mobilization offline. Not all are successful in transforming the public policy to be more pro-poor or, protecting right, but at least we can see from a positive point of view that this gives a potential in, benefiting from the internet penetrations. And then it's also promoting a different type of people-to-people collaborations. We are now looking at a different initiative developed by non-state actor and internet user individually. Like I give you an example that here I give an example of Akademi Berbagi. It's actually an online-offline knowledge sharing forum initiated by internet users, and now it's going across the country. So it starts from Jakarta, but now going across the country. They're combining online and offline forum where people are voluntarily sharing their knowledge. And the topic is ranging, it depends on the expertise that people are willing to give in. So this is also another example how internet positively influence the society. We also know Kita Bisa is an startup. It's a crowd fundraising startup that can help people to raise public fundraising to support their good causes. And then, aside from that, it also increased the flow of informations that may pose also another challenges in terms of what kind of informations and how to filter the informations by the users. And last but not least is about the economic opportunity, as always. The new type of economic activities are there because facilitated by the internet, such as the online hailing transportations. We have what we call Gojek, Grab Bike, and other platform companies that operating in the countries. For example, Gojek is a motorbike ride sharing online, motorbike hailing services, and now it gives a job to 1 million people of Indonesia. So looking at the magnitude of people who are benefiting from that, it also poses a different challenges to the government on how to regulate these applications. Challenges, some said that one of the challenges, biggest challenges, is the euphoria by internet user. So they behave differently online and offline. In online, they tend to be more blatant and sometimes more rude in discussing about things posted online. And to a certain extent, some lead into defamatory clauses, case reported by a person that feel being defamed by the expression they put online. We also dealing with fake news and hoax. It's a huge problem nowadays in the countries because the spread of the informations is at the unprecedented level that the government cannot control. especially with social media and messengers like WhatsApp, which is very popular to people. So it really poses challenges on how to make sure that the government as well as the users can control the circulations of fake news. And then, as I said before, now it's becoming more and more important arena, especially in regard to political contestation among different elites. Now Indonesia is facing, next year will be electoral year for Indonesia. We're going to have presidential election as well as parliamentary member elections. So this is also give a challenge on how internet become an extension of political contestation they have offline. Aside from that, a common problem we are facing is online pornography, cyberbullying, as well as child pornography online. So the picture I gave you is some of the example in expression that they put online, and then some of them lead, 3 of them actually lead into criminal, prosecution against those who are posted online. It's because of the sensitivity of the issues. The second one at the bottom is about the president and his wife, and the word that they use to express their disappointment is actually go beyond, normal expression that people can have as a polite expressions. But then the problem is to what extent then the freedom of expressions and the limit, to what extent we need actually put the limit of freedom of expression. To what extent some expression can actually be considered defamatory against other people, and how could we defend that as part of the, exercise, as part of the way people exercise their right. Now, in regard to the government policies in the internet, it's also posted new challenges for maintaining the freedom we have online. What we observe is first, after the amendment of the cyber law, ITE law, is the main law that governs internet in Indonesia, because of the public cry out about the use and misuse of defamatory clause and criminal sanctions on that, now the government reduced the sanction from 6 years to 4 years. So that will give an implications that somebody could prevent somebody not to be detained or not to be subject to pre-trial detentions. But then, it also, with that amendment, give more control for the government to control online space. In regard to, I put it there, that now the government, through the Ministry of Communication and Information, have new power in directly cut off the access on the information online if they thought it's actually being considered as a threat to national security, national interest, and public morale. That's the gray area that always being contested by different civil society back home. And it's prone to be abused by the, the authority and policy makers. So, aside from that, with the new law, the Ministry of Communication and Information officials have also a power to do and to start a criminal prosecution, because then they are assigned as part of the prosecutor office in collaborations with Attorney General office. So they don't need to wait to the police to start the investigation. They can actually start and launch their own investigations and submit it together with the police to the prosecutor office for further legal proceedings. So this also, there is also a questions of check and balances in here, because talking about the transparencies and basic rules, that the more power you have, the more possibility that the power is tend to corrupt is there. And then, aside from this ministry, there is also a new unit established within the National Police, and it's given effect shortly, like few months after the establishment. Like they've made a report to public that they are dealing with 3,325 hate speech cases under the criminal, clause within the new ITE law. So the problem with this is to what extent the accuracies and to what extent the cases are biased in terms of the power relations, because sometimes from a different observation we have done with the use of defamation clause, in most cases it's actually power relation bias. Usually it being used by those who are more powerful against those who are less powerful, especially in regard to public critics. So there is also a question in regard with this new directorate within the national police on how to control that it's not being used and abused. And in addition to that, we also observe that there are more regulation is in the list of being produced by the Ministry of Communication and Informations to extend the control over the platform companies through what they call intermediary liability. That platforms and internet and electronic systems provider is also responsible for any information transmitted on their channel. So at the technical level, now the ministry also equipped themselves with a new machine to do an active crawling and filtering of informations on the basis that the previous system, which is based on the people's reporting to the minister, is considered is not effective, and then they move into a more active actions in crawling the information themselves continuously. The unit is supported by 59 analysts, and it's working independently. I mean, with or without the report from the public. So the government can be seen more active in controlling the information and finding the information that deemed to be, that they see is unlawful and is a threat for the government. And then aside from the Ministry of Communication and Information, the government also start to establish a new body that they call cybersecurity and encryption bodies. They also have and equipped with the power of doing surveillance online as part of defending national security and national interests. There hasn't been any check and balances mechanism where public can actually have an access on how this body exercise their power and use the power and what kind of type of surveillance that actually being conducted by this. Aside from those government-related agencies and institutional framework, we also now dealing with the use of criminal clause, especially against online expressions, especially in regard with defamation clause. So this is the type of crimes defined and contained in that law. For your informations, there are two big type of crimes that can send you to prisons. But most of the time, the first type one is the one that is exercised by those who are in power. And this is the case. It's pretty small. The left side is the one that collected and compiled by civil society organizations. And if you see from the report from the police, there is a huge gap in terms of the number. And we believe it's because of the lack of resources that the civil society have in regard to these issues. And I've told you about the power relation bias in terms of online defamation case. So in lieu of the conclusion, what could we actually learn from the situation, and what could we actually prepare for the futures? I see, at least in regard to the functions and professional functions of librarian, the geofiltering mechanisms on pornographic and other issues that sensitive to the country might relate and affect the function and the flow of information that any librarian can do, as well as common internet user also doing. And then aside from that, because based on the new law, librarian can actually be considered as well as a person that providing informations, then they might be prone to the use of intermediary liability when it comes to the idea that information is considered to be unlawful by the government. So to a certain extent, it poses a new challenges for the librarian as well as for the civil society in general. So this is the last slide that I have, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Indra, for that fascinating summary of the issues in Indonesia, which resonate, I think, with many countries around the world. We're delighted to have speakers from this geographical region today, but I think it's interesting to reflect on the commonality of the issues that are being described today as they affect many countries around the world. Our next speaker, who's going to talk about freedom of expression in Malaysia, is Azmi Sharom. Azmi is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Malaysia, where he's taught since 1990, teaching human rights law and international environmental law, and he's current convener of the Southeast Asian Human Rights and Peace Studies Network, and editor of their Human Rights Peace in Southeast Asia Outlook. Azmi.
Good evening. Firstly, thank you to IFLA for inviting me here. I have no slides. I put on a suit for this. So please look at me so that my effort is not wasted. I kind of wish this conference was held 4 months earlier because things were a bit different in this country then, and a bit more interesting and a bit more dangerous, which always makes it more fun. But anyway, for the purposes of this paper, I shall be using the international standard with regards to the definition of freedom of expression, which means not only your freedom to express yourself, but also your freedom to obtain information. So it goes both ways. Naturally, expression encompasses a very wide array of media. It includes art, it includes films, it includes music, theater, all right? But because I'm speaking to librarians, I shall be limiting my talk to the printed form. I'm timing myself. All right, okay, so I'm going to look at a few laws which have a serious effect on books and magazines and publications in Malaysia, and these are the Sedition Act, the Printing, Presses and Publications Act, the Official Secrets Act, and I'll also be looking at some recent developments with regards to religious laws and its effect on the freedom of expression. But first, a bit of context. Yeah? Malaysia is not party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the main treaty, in my point of view, regarding the freedom of expression. We are only party to 3 human rights treaties: CEDAW, about women, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's all we are party to. We're not even party to the Convention Against Torture, which leads me to believe we like torture, but I'm not sure. We have a constitution, though. We do have a constitution, and the constitution does have Article 10, which says that we have freedom of speech, and it says every citizen has the right to freedom of speech and expression. Every citizen, yeah? So some of you guys don't have that right here. I do. But Parliament may, by law, impose restrictions on these freedoms. There's a general section in 2A, which says, you know, for the purposes of defamation, incitement of any offense, public order, morality, good relations with other countries. But there's also specific restrictions which Parliament may impose regarding the Constitution itself and regarding the special privileges of Malays, the use of Malay as a national language, and a few other things. So it looks great. It says, every citizen has a right to freedom of speech and expression, but the Constitution actually allows the government to make a lot of laws for a lot of reasons to restrict our freedom of expression. But what is particularly worrying or troublesome about our Constitution is that there is no preamble. There isn't any underlying principle which is specifically put in the Constitution in order to aid interpretation of the Constitution. So what this means is that if you look at the law and take it literally, then it's possible for very broad mandate given to government to make laws which actually are very much against the freedom of expression. But we'll look at that with a bit more detail later on. Oh, just one point, yeah? I'll be coming back to this. The Constitution says Parliament may make laws which restrict the freedom of expression. In Malaysia, you have Parliament, which is the federal lawmaking body, and then you have the state legislatures, which make laws only for the state in their own limited jurisdiction. All right? But Constitution is crystal clear. Only Parliament can make laws to restrict freedom of expression. So with that background, let's go into the laws. The Sedition Act, this is a relic of the British colonial government. Thank you, Your Majesty. The law was made 9 years before independence. And it's extremely broad. A seditious tendency, if you commit an act which has a seditious tendency, then that is an offense. And a seditious tendency is, there's a whole list here, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is to bring into hatred or contempt or to excite disaffection against any ruler or against any government. All right, so I can't say anything to, make you feel hatred or contempt. To bring into hatred or contempt or to excite disaffection against the administration of justice in Malaysia or in any state. So from here, you can see the language is extremely vague, extremely broad, and the Sedition Act has been used quite extensively, particularly in the last 5 years, to restrict the expression, the freedom of expression. Theoretically, if you are saying something in order to show that a ruler or the government has made a mistake vis-a-vis the Constitution or vis-a-vis the law, then that is not seditious. But again, this is not a guarantee of protection, because there have been cases where someone has pointed out a particular point, a mistake made by a ruler, and was charged with sedition and was found guilty of sedition, even though what he said was merely to correct a mistaken belief on the part of the ruler. So it's not really much protection, because if they really want to go for you, then they will. Now, the offenses of sedition includes, this is particularly relevant to librarians, the printing, publishing, selling of a sale, distribution, or reproduction of any publication, seditious publication, or the importation of any seditious publications. So there's a lot of ground here. Of course, if you say something seditious, that is an offense as well. And the punishment is, they've increased the punishment actually to compulsory jail sentence now. Whereas before you could just be fined. The maximum jail sentence is 5 years, but now after an amendment to the law, there is no more fine. You'll just go to jail, even if it's a first offense. Another law which is used is the Printing, Presses and Publications Act, the PPPA. This is the main law that is used in the country to censor publications, the Printing, Presses, Publications Act. But what its what it's most well known for is that it is fundamentally a licensing law. So if you are a publisher of, say, a newspaper, you need a license in order to publish. Now that's all well and good, but the license can be revoked at any time by the minister. Okay, and this has happened in the past. For example, the newspaper The Edge was publishing quite a lot of analysis on the 1MDB scandal, which our previous Prime Minister was supposedly heavily involved in, and they got their license pulled. All right? They went to court, and they won in court because the judge held that the order was defective. It was vague. It didn't specify exactly what was said, which was wrong, and it was fundamentally unfair and unjust because it was, there was too short a time for the paper to correct any mistakes, etc. So the judge overturned the ban. Now this sounds great and fun, but in the meantime, for 3 months, the paper could not publish. Now, of course, any publisher, especially a newspaper or magazine, if you can't publish for 3 months, that means you're not making money for 3 months. So it's very unreasonable, really, to expect such problems to be solved by the judiciary because that takes time, and in that time, huge losses will be made by the publishers. But the Printing Presses and Publications Act is also used to actually ban books. I think there are 2 books banned right now where I have chapters in them. I think, because it changes, yeah, they ban stuff, and if you go online to their website, you can see what books are banned. They have a list of banned books. There's about, at any given time, just under 2,000 books which are banned in Malaysia. Now, the reasons why they ban the books, looking at the list, I actually did this once. I looked at the list and tried to get some sort of theme. And generally speaking, they ban books because of sexual content. So, for example, 50 Shades of Grey is banned, which actually may not be a bad thing. An appalling book, apparently. I don't know. I've never read it. Books on religion, which do not fit the Sunni Shafi'i brand of Islam, which is the official brand of Islam in this country, particularly books on Shia Islam. They like banning those. And of course, political books, if they were anti-government political books. Another strange book which was banned was Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, what's strange about this is that in English you can find it; it's not banned, but in Malay it's banned. So there's a weird dynamic going on here, and the way that it works. How do they ban the book? The minister, I think the Minister of Home Affairs, will normally be informed of an undesirable publication by a department called the Publication and Quranic Text Control Division. And so he'll get a list of books which this division says is undesirable, and then he will proceed to ban it. And it's his absolute discretion. He can ban this book, or he or she, whoever the minister is, can ban these books once it's brought to their attention. If the book is imported, the importation also will be stopped. You can't. The mere possession of a banned book is an offense, right? So it's not just a question of buying it, selling it, distributing it. Even just having it is an offense. So any person who prints, imports, produces, reproduces, publishes, sells, issues, circulates, offers for sale, distributes, or possess such books could face a maximum jail sentence of 3 years and a fine of 20,000 Malaysian ringgit, or both. So it's quite a powerful law to be used to censor things. Now, of course, you can go to court to challenge a book ban. Some people don't bother because it's just too much trouble and too much expense, but some have gone to court. And the results have been a bit mixed. Generally, the courts haven't been particularly in favor of the person whose book was banned. So, for example, if the ban is unreasonable, it's possible for the ban to be lifted by the court if it's unreasonable. But what is considered reasonable is generally more procedural than substantive. That is to say, that it's been decided that if the minister had gone through the necessary procedures before banning the book, then that is reasonable. Whether substantively the decision made any sense doesn't matter, right? And there's a lot also of values here. So there's a particular book written which was very anti the last government, and that was banned. And the judge said that the book used high octane language, whatever that might mean. And that it was too assertive. It would add fuel to the opposition. The fact that the book was written by a member of the opposition party, of course they want to add fuel to the opposition. That's their purpose, right? And this whole business of high octane language, just what is high octane language? So it would appear that if you want to be really critical of the government, then you must write like Dickens or the Bronte sisters or something along those lines. And then, if your language is genteel, perhaps that'll be okay, right? So, what we see here is we don't really have that much protection from the courts with regards to these awful laws. Now, another law I want to look at is the Official Secrets Act. Now, this is a law which allows, it's a federal law. We don't have a freedom of information law, at least not at the federal level. We have a freedom of information law at the state level. 2 states have made state legislature regarding the freedom of information, the states of Penang and the state of Selangor. I live in Selangor, I'm from Penang, so that's a good thing. But they are quite weak because they are still subject to the federal law, which is the Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secrets Act basically empowers any government officer who's given the authority by the minister. It empowers any government officer to declare anything an official secret, right? So it's, again, there's no concept of substance. It's just a procedure. I say this is a secret. It doesn't matter whether it has no bearing to security or to the safety of the people. Anything can be declared a secret, right? The shopping list of the former wife of the prime minister can be declared a secret, and it probably is. Now, once something is declared a secret, if you are in possession of it or if you distribute it, then of course it's an offense and you could go to jail. Needless to say, this power is a convenient manner with which to hide a multitude of sins. And it's a serious hindrance to any concept of the freedom of information. Now, recently, what I find particularly troubling with regards to freedom of expression in Malaysia is the use of religion to restrict the freedom of expression. And a few cases I want to look at here. But before we go into that, again, a bit of context. Article 3 of our Constitution states that Islam is the religion of the Federation, but other religions may be practiced in peace. All right? And this has been declared in a case in 1988 to not mean that this country is an Islamic state, merely that for formal occasions, if you're going to have worship, etc., it will be Islamic in nature. This is the case of Che Omar Che So in 88. But recently, there's been a disturbing trend where religion has been used more and more as excuse to restrict the freedom of expression. One particular case is about the Catholic Church in this country. Now, the Catholic Church in Malaysia publishes, or used to publish, I think they still do, they publish a newsletter called the Herald. And it's mainly in English, but there's this little section in Bahasa Malaysia, in Malay. And when they write in Malay, they use the term, the Malay word Tuhan, to describe, as a translation for God, and they use the term Allah for the Lord, right? So that they use these two terms. The government took offense, and they said that, you know, Allah is only to be used by Muslims, and the Herald had its license withdrawn to publish. Now, I'm not going to go into the linguistic arguments here. It's just, for me, it's quite troubling for other reasons. You see, the thing about the Herald is that nobody really knew about it except Catholics, and I'm not sure many Catholics knew about it. It only became famous because of the ban. Let's be quite clear about this. The Constitution does say that although everyone has a freedom of religion, you cannot. There is a restriction. There's a possibility that there could be laws made to control propagation of religion to Muslims. All right. So if I was a Mormon, and I see them wandering around, actually, they're always very well dressed. If I was a Mormon, I could talk about my beliefs to a Buddhist, to another Christian, a Hindu, but I cannot do it to a Muslim. Right? Now, so you need permission. It can be illegal, yeah? So the Catholic Church knew this. So the Herald actually has, in quite clear letters, you know, this is not to be distributed to Muslims. Right? So the newsletter actually has a sort of like a warning, you know, not for children under 12, not for Muslims. At the High Court, the church won, and the ban was lifted, but then the government appealed, and in the Court of Appeal, the judge in the leading judgment, he interpreted Article 3 very strangely. Article 3 is very clear. Islam is a religion of the Federation. Other religions may be practiced in peace. And then what he says was, what this means is that, you know, when you want to practice your religion in peace and harmony, well, this Article 3 is to protect the sanctity of Islam. And the purpose of it is to insulate Islam against any threat or any possible or probable threat faced by the religion of Islam. This is a weird interpretation. I don't know how you can interpret a line which is so simple, you know, Islam is a federation of religion, to suddenly include this call for defense. But that's what he said. And he says that, you know, the Herald is a danger because it can be used for propagation. And also it's a dangerous, if they continue to use Allah, it's dangerous because it will disrupt the even tempo of the life of the Malaysian community, as well as the sanctity of Islam. Now, like I said, you know, nobody knew about this publication until the government banned it. Right? Once the government banned it, then there were demonstrations, there were people, you know, being very angry and saying Allah is only for Muslims, etc., etc. But they wouldn't have known about it if the government had done nothing. So in a way, I see the Herald as a complete victim. You were banned, And because of the ban, you became well known, and because you were well known, you got, extremists shouting and screaming, etc., and that's used to say, yeah, that justifies the ban. Right? So it's quite insane. And also the way the court interpreted Article 3 to make it something which I don't think it was meant to be. Another case in a similar vein is about a book published by a company called ZI Publications. The book is called, it's by a writer called Irshad Manji, and it's called Allah, Liberty and Love. Now, the book was sold in English, again, with no problem, but when it was translated into Malay by ZI Publications, it was banned. But here's the thing. It was banned using a state law. That means a law made by the state legislative assembly. It was not banned by using a federal law. Now remember what I said right in the beginning of the lecture? Only Parliament can make laws that restrict the freedom of expression. And here we have a state law which was used to restrict the freedom of expression. I would have thought that this was as clear-cut as can be. But no. ZI Publications lost, and the court held that, yes, Article 10 says that Parliament can make law, only Parliament can make laws that restrict the freedom of expression, but let's not forget the sanctity of Islam, again, and let's not forget that the state law in question was not about restricting the freedom of expression, it was really about criminalizing anything which goes against the precepts of Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine we have 13 states. Surely our human rights must be the same wherever we are. If states are allowed to make laws restricting our human rights, then I could have different rights depending on where I am. If I'm driving from KL up to my hometown in Penang, I will go through KL, then Selangor, my rights might be different. Then I'm in Perak, I have more rights. Then I'm in Penang, I have more rights even. And then I'm in Kedah, oh my God, my rights have gone downhill. It doesn't make sense. That's why to see whether they live up to their promises. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. A lot of food for thought, I think, in that presentation. Next speaker is Soares Paul Barua, who is Policy Director at the Centre for Internet and Society in India, where he leads the organization's work on issues on freedom of expression online and certain framework issues of the internet. So I'd like to welcome to the lectern Soares Paul Barua. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to IFLA for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful conference. I've had the, let's say, unfortunate experience of having to organize a 5 or 6 day international conference earlier, and I know the hard work it takes going into this, and I can see all the specific details really being attended to here. So a big thank you to IFLA for organizing this so well. Okay, so my topic for today, sorry for the cliche title, What's Up with WhatsApp, Polarization and Lynchings in India. So what I'll be doing is, so I come from, as Martyn pointed out, I come from the Center for Internet and Society in India, and this is a civil society policy research body, and this is the perspective I'll be bringing in today. And even though I've specified WhatsApp as well as India in the title, the contents of my talk will zoom in and out, so you can look at similar situations as well as similar technologies and look at the issues and how they may be analogous. Okay, so traditionally, free speech has been about, it's been seen in the context of censorship of problematic speech by governments. That is, censorship by governments of problematic speech or troubling speech. Now, of course, censorship is free speech campaigners have very good reason to fear censorship. However, many of these reasons have led to a tendency of responding to problematic speech with a call for counter-speech, as opposed to censorship by the government. However, it's growing increasingly clear that this approach of saying counter-speech will solve the problem comes from perhaps only a position of power and privilege, and this is a simplistic take on how to address the situation. And now, as everyone keeps saying, especially in the West, we live in a post-truth world, and this brings in several new power dynamics that need to be examined and new aspects to the freedom of expression debate. So in my talk today, what I want to stress on is that if we want to avoid censorship and surveillance of speech issues, we need to look beyond this current debate of censorship and address or think of how to address some of the harms that are being caused by the so-called problematic speech. This is necessary because it's not just citizens and governments that we're talking about anymore. They're also what I would call internet nation companies. Internet nations, I'm referring to, of course, the former startups, small startups, which are now these huge Facebooks, Amazons, Googles, Twitters of the world. And from their earlier days of being a startup, they've now, through consolidation, pretty much run the internet. And if you want to get on the internet, the chances are very high that you will be using one or more of these services. Now, of course, Facebook is not just Facebook. Facebook is also WhatsApp and Instagram. Google is not just search. It's also YouTube and Gmail, etc. And so you will almost definitely be using these services if you are trying to get on the internet. And why it's important to consider these, what I'm referring to as internet nations, is because they, through their code, through their policies, are ending up laying down the rules of cyberspace, where much of our ability to exercise our freedom of speech now lays. And in looking to address some of these issues, we're not only addressing the censorship question, but we're also getting a bit closer to the meaningful intellectual freedom in a polarized world. Okay. So platforms and power. There's something strange going on in India right now. Since January 2017, there have been 69 or maybe more cases of mob attacks in which 33 or more people have been actually lynched to death. Now, why is this strange, aside from the violent nature of it? Almost all of these came off the back of rumors spread on WhatsApp that children were being kidnapped by certain people. So the video would show a child being kidnapped by two people on a bike, or different variations of that, followed with a message saying that watch out for outsiders in your community, your children are at risk. Now, of course, in all of these situations, or nearly all, I don't think evidence is there for all of them, but in nearly all of these situations, there's been no link between the people who have been lynched, even the people who have been lynched to death, and a child actually being kidnapped. So this is almost completely rumor-based. They don't know where these rumors started from. They don't know who's pushing them, if they're being pushed. They do know that a lot of these activities, mobilizations, are happening over WhatsApp. So this has led to a big outcry by the Indian government, where they are saying WhatsApp needs to take responsibility for what's happening over here. And of course, this fake news, if I can call it that, or disinformation problem, is not limited to India. It's very common in several countries across the world. But the Indian government in particular is coming down very heavily on WhatsApp, saying that if it doesn't take responsibility, then the Indian government will take action against WhatsApp. And so as recently as 5 days ago, there was a meeting between WhatsApp officials and the Indian government, where the Indian government laid out demands, if I can call them that, saying there needs to be a local grievance officer, there needs to be traceability of messages. WhatsApp is most well known for its end-to-end encryption, which means that only the receiver and sender can see the contents of that message. So now the big question is WhatsApp. So WhatsApp has 200+ million users in India. This is a very significant base, of course, and this is growing every day. So WhatsApp cannot afford to ignore what the Indian government is saying. At the same time, the big question is now, can it break this end-to-end encryption? What happens to privacy? These are big questions and concerns which are now going on in India. So now I'll just take a step back. And what I was saying earlier about counter-speech not being effective. So let me expand a bit on why power and privilege is important over there. So the traditional understanding is that, you know, if someone says something that is problematic, you counter it by saying what's wrong with it, why that's problematic. However, there's no magical balancing that happens once you give this counter speech. It's not like, let's say, a Nazi person gets a book deal, and then an African American gets a counter book deal where they address this. That's not going to somehow magically balance the harms that are being caused by the first book deal. So in India, again, and again, I think it's prevalent in several other countries in the global south, political parties have realized the viral and powerful nature of social media. And so they've, in India at least, they've created IT cells, information technology cells, which are meant to spread, I'm going to use the word propaganda, through social media. And in this material, I mean, there's some truth, there's some white lies, and there's some brazen polarizing lies. And these are spread through a massive network on an almost instantaneous basis. Someone somewhere will say that this message should go out, and by tomorrow, this will be spread over thousands of WhatsApp groups all across the country. And these are messages which, I mean, they could be complete fabrications, and there's no one to check that, to fact check that. So what happened as a response to this is a few fact-checking bodies, people who started as a hobby in their spare time have moved on to organization responses. Fact-checking bodies have come up to counter these lies being spread on social media. However, what's actually happening here? Of your audience of about, let's say, 100 people are reading that message, maybe 1% will actually read that fact-check part of it and be convinced that this was a fabrication. So the power of social media has a lot to do with the power dynamics behind the resources that go into spreading different types of material. And then there's an additional factor of the fact that oppressed minorities don't have the luxury of this counter speech. There's a perpetual issue of harassment, which is wide at play. And there's an interesting study that showed, again in US, where someone made a Twitter bot. So on Twitter, whenever there'd be hate speech against African Americans, this Twitter bot would recognize that hate speech and provide an instantaneous response saying that, you know, this is a cruel thing to say. These are people too, something along those lines, to humanize the victims of the hate speech to the person making that tweet in that case. And the results of the study was very interesting. So what was seen is that if this Twitter bot used the display icon of a white Caucasian person, the person making that hate speech would go back to engaging in a civil nature in the majority of the time, and sometimes even apologize. If the display icon of that Twitter bot was an African American, or seemed like an African American, they would not only double down on their position, they would start insulting that bot as well, not realizing that it is a bot. So counter speech, again, I mean, this goes to show that counter speech is rarely an effective option for especially oppressed minorities. And we need to accept that this is not an effective option. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the government is going to step in and say that for the safety and security of people, we need to monitor and track down speech online. And this is a justifiable claim because otherwise these harms are happening. So unless there are other ways of addressing this, they will come in. And then what will happen? There'll be state-built apparatus to monitor social media. And this is already happening in some countries. In India, there's talk of what's being called a social media communications hub. And this is with the express intent of monitoring and shaping people's communications online. So these are dangers that we need to keep in mind. Okay. So moving on to the public sphere, the fragmentation of the public sphere. So earlier, in the pre-digital age, there were relatively fewer news sources. There were a lot fewer news sources. These are mostly mainstream newspapers, TV channels, etc. And so what this naturally meant is that there were fewer voices being heard, and the voices that were heard came through mass media editors and editing. Now, the pervasiveness of the internet, of course, brought with it a plurality of voices, the ability of ordinary citizens to express themselves online, to get that voice heard, spread, in some cases in individuals' earlier zero voice has now been magnified to a national or international level. And so I'm not going to go on about the benefits of these communication methods, but I am going to talk about some of the downsides that have arisen and have not been adequately addressed, in my experience at least. So one clear downside, which I guess people are noticing, is it's legitimizing extreme voices. Spaces where earlier extreme voices were not allowed now have a platform, and as more and more people hear these views, others with similar views feel legitimized and start forming self-select interest groups. And with these outlier views getting repeated more and more, the norm is shifting to more extreme directions. You have echo chambers being built where different voices are saying the same thing and they feel this is normalized. You have filter bubbles which are created. Filter bubbles are when you don't, because of the algorithms of social media, you are shown only people with similar views, and you don't realize that there are counter views outside of your circle or what the algorithm is telling you your circle should be. So with the creation of these echo chambers and filter bubbles, there's a strong legitimization of extreme views taking place. Next is, so the public sphere earlier is now coming down to a more personalized level. And while this is happening across different avenues, I'm going to specifically look at election material and propaganda. So these would always, in the past, be held, like I said, on TV channels, on mainstream newspapers. What's happening now is very different. When claims are made in mass media, they're very easy to counter. If a main newspaper holds one view which has lies in them, the next day the opposition party can say that this is not true, this is the actual truth, and people have access to both those views equally. Have electoral rolls. And what political parties would do, they'd go door-to-door campaigning, giving out their information. Now they're also collecting people's phone numbers. So now they have the names and the phone numbers. They come back and they look up that individual's social media profile, they look up what information they have in the online space, and they start building categories where they place these people. So if they're likely to vote for you, they're in category A. If they're on the fence, they're in category B. Then if they're not going to vote for you, they're in category C. In all three of these categories, you have what will motivate them to vote for you. What fears do they have? What insecurities do they have? These tend to be identity-based insecurities, so they keep pushing down the view that that identity is being victimized, perhaps, or that they're being treated unfairly. And so you have these polarized views you're specifically targeted for your insecurities, for your weaknesses, and these messages are being sent to you on your handheld device where no one else has a chance to even see the message, let alone counter it. Okay. So, of course, what this means is there's no space for backlash, there's no space for accountability. And that takes me to the next point that I want to talk about: confidence, trust, and truth value. So, again, just taking a step back, if I were to shout out a message to 1,000 people, I would want to fact check myself, I would want to make sure what I'm saying is accurate. However, if, let's say I have 10,000 followers on Twitter, I want to tweet out something, I'm going to take maybe 5 seconds thinking about it and put it out. With my communication device now in my hand, I have a greater confidence of this is my space, I can say what I want. I don't have to think through the consequences of what's going to happen. And of course, this is even though knowing that your voice out on, let's say, Twitter, it can be retweeted to millions of people, it could be taken up by a newspaper, all of that is known, but it's still your space. You are free to do what you want in your space, is the general sense that you have. Now, let's go back to those electoral messages which are coming to you, the ones targeting you. Let's say they come to you on WhatsApp. You believe these because they are preying on your insecurities, and now you forward these to your friends and families. Your friends and family know they can trust you. This is not a claim being made by some mass media or fake news or whatever. They know you as a person, they tend to trust you, So they see this, they believe it. So this starts shaping your views. This starts shaping how you interact with people around you. This starts shaping how you engage or don't engage with people with differing views. In addition to this, there's something called, which I'll call the truth value of new technologies. And this basically means that when a new technology comes out, people view it as more objective because for some reason it's in a new form, so maybe it's more likely to be true. And this stretches back to a long time. For example, when photography first became a thing, there was a person, William Mumler, who did some mistakes in the room where you develop the photos, the dark room, whatever it's called, I forget. And because of that mistake, there were some double exposures. And when his photos came out, people started seeing that and believing that there were ghosts in those photos. And now, in the US at least, this was around the time of one of the major wars, I think the Civil War. And people wanted to see their dead relatives. People wanted a way to communicate. So when they were seeing something which gave them a way of believing what they wanted to believe, they started believing that these photos were showing their relatives, their dead relatives, still around them and still wanting to be with them. So of course, William Mumler was like, he figured out what had happened, but he went with it because why not? And now similarly with these new technologies, we have this issue where people tend to believe it just because it's a new form. They don't stop and question as much as they should. And finally, norms engineering. So in Rwanda, as everyone probably knows, the civil war which happened, there was this component of the radio station, RTLM, I think it was called, where certain sections of the population were constantly dehumanized, violence against them was constantly advocated, and the messaging from the radio station said that this is the norm, you are an outsider if you don't feel similarly. And this type of messaging kept repeating and repeating. So there's a scholar, Elizabeth Palak from Princeton University, who decided to study this in the present day. And the traditional understanding was that you change someone's ideas by engaging with those ideas, you point out why you disagree with them, and reasonable people will understand what's wrong and change their conclusions. However, from her study, what she found out was that people's beliefs on repeated, when you feed them these ideas, they don't change. What does change people's behavior, not their beliefs, is the idea that social norms around them are changing. So this has several consequences. If people's beliefs or perceptions of social norms are changing how they behave, regardless of their beliefs, then these constant messages, this disinformation, this fake news, this election propaganda which comes in, it has a very important role to play in how we understand the public sphere, what kind of information is being communicated, the role it plays in society. Okay, now I want to connect this with what I'm calling the attention economy. We're generally taught to understand that with more plurality, there's more competition. More competition is a good thing. And of course, more production of voices is a good thing. However, as I pointed out earlier, more production of voices doesn't mean that all voices have the equal ability to be heard. In fact, some get drowned out because there are too many voices speaking. And now there's a bigger need to grab attention, because attention is getting scarce. There's a scarcity of attention. And what grabs attention? News which is shocking, disgusting, scary, or otherwise excites you or says, pay attention to you, pay attention to me. This is something that as a society we need to pay attention to, ironically enough, and not encourage. There's an interesting analogy that a scholar, Zainab Tufaki, makes. And she makes this with the junk food industry. She points out that if you keep giving people chips and candy, chips and candy, chips and candy, they will keep craving more chips and candy. If they get desensitized to the salt, to the sugar, and what happens? They want more and more. If you keep putting that in front of them, even if they know it's not good for them, there's a high likelihood that they will take more of it. And this is something that the marketing world has figured out a long time ago. In the beginning of the new year, or rather the end of the previous year, all your gyms will start advertising the memberships because they know people will they tell themselves that, I know this is good for me, I'm going to sign up for the gym for this year, and within a month, everyone stops if they go at all. This is something Netflix has figured out. They know that if you ask people, will you binge watch shows up till 2 a.m. in the morning? People are going to say, no, that's not something I want to do. But they put out the whole series of episodes rather than show by show as it used to be, because they know people will binge watch. In fact, even your taste in movies, while people like to think they will watch these, let's say, high production, if I can call it class movies, what Netflix information shows is people tend to watch comfort movies a lot more, and this is something that, this basically points to a bigger trend of people say they want one thing, their behavior betrays them. So, as a society, we need to pay attention to this attention economy and take steps to ensure that we aren't giving in to what is not good for us. Coming back to the junk food example, this doesn't mean we ban junk food. What it does mean is that if our children are hungry, we first give them nutritious food and then give them the option of taking junk food. And we add into this, we have to increase the supply of what we actually want in the longer term and not focus on short-term gratification material. We have to, other things like labeling, spreading awareness of the harms, all of these things need to go hand in hand. And we need to take these analogies and use them in this attention economy for information as well. And finally, I'll take two examples before concluding. Co-opting the rebels. So both my examples center around piracy, one of the high seas variety, the other of the electronic variety. So back in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, whenever it was that piracy of the high seas was common, the English crown and the Spanish crown both noticed that this was a huge problem, this is getting out of hand. And they sent the navies, the ships out to try to deal with this problem. It was a complete failure. What they realized was, hey, why not co-opt these pirates, pay them, let's call them privateers, that's what they were called, and let them pirate the English crown would pay them to pirate the Spanish ships, the Spanish crown would do the same for the English ships. So, the second example, which is incidentally the creation of Hollywood. This happened in the late 1800s when Thomas Edison first patented a projection machine. And incidentally, this was something his assistant had primarily made. He had very little to do with it. But he was a shrewd businessman. He got the patent for this. And then he followed up with the IP rights for surrounding technologies as well. This was in New Jersey, in the East Coast. So what happened was the pirates of the day back then, they were using this technology. They were making films infringing on the rights, so to speak. And Edison filed a whole bunch of lawsuits against them. So they all ran out to the Wild West, and they landed up in California. And a few years later, Hollywood was created. And now Hollywood is going after all the pirates everywhere else, incidentally. And both these examples show a tendency for governments and the rebels, after a period of a lot of unsettling behavior, realizing that if they coalesce and come together, they have a lot more to gain. So, as civil society, what we need to watch out for, we have to address both these internet nations, as I referred to them, as well as ensuring that state-based apparatus for monitoring freedom of speech, for censoring freedom of speech, both these forces don't combine. We have to start addressing the problems that are being created by new media, as well as ensure that the government doesn't step in to solve these for us, and in the process, curtail our rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Soares. Can I just remind you that we'll be taking questions at the end after our next speaker, so please do have your questions ready. There are microphones around the hall. As I say, if you are listening on the streamed, on the live streaming, please, you can put your questions in at any time. Also, if you would rather put a question in anonymously, and you're in the hall, please feel free to do that. If you go to www.menti.com and put the code 833471, so that's www.menti.com, that's MENTI, menti.com, and use the code 832471. That's the same route that people listening to the live streaming are using, and we'll get your question that way. Our final speaker is Ming Kwok Lim, who is going to talk on how to align national laws with the international standards on freedom of expression, although that does end with a question mark. Ming Kwok is the advisor for communication and information for the UNESCO office in Jakarta, and he's been involved in the global campaign to strengthen and raise awareness of freedom of expression, press freedom, the safety of journalists, and advises on media policy, and expanding the journalism curricula to reflect the new Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to welcome Ming Kwok Lim. Thank you.
Thank you, Martyn. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to IFLA for organizing this event and this session in particular. And I'm also very grateful to be able to walk from the end of the stage so I can warm up my body. And also, because I'm the last speaker of the day, I'm giving myself some permission to do some flexing exercises, and I do welcome you all to join. It is the last session, so let's shake it out a little bit so we have some energy to continue. And just a quick note to the interpreters, I will have some changes to my original presentation, taking into consideration of what the previous speakers have also mentioned. I will be highlighting a few areas concerning intellectual freedom, freedom of expressions, through the perspective of media freedom in particular. And specifically, I will be looking at four areas, four dimensions that was also highlighted in the World Trends for Freedom of Expression and Media Development. It is one of our latest publications from UNESCO, and I do invite all the libraries here to please put it up on your online repository. It is free of charge. Put all of it up, and we are very happy to share those publications with everyone around the world. So first off, the first category is what we call the slides are not up yet. How do I change the slides? Oh. Okay.
There we are. My apologies.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there are four areas that the World Trends looked at, which the first one is actually called the media freedom, the second one, media pluralism, media independence, and the fourth is safety of journalists. Now, why do we look at that? That is because those are some of the areas that we think encompasses the issues of freedom of expression, access to information, and what we call the free flow of information, free flow of ideas through words and images. And I would like to link at the same time these four dimensions with various international standards. When we talk about international standards, we often refer to the agreements, the resolutions, the various conventions and declarations that has been agreed by member states, consensus or by majority vote. They include, of course, what was adopted in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which, of course, Azmi has already mentioned as well, the various resolutions adopted at the UN General Assembly, at the UN Security Councils, for example, the Human Rights Council, and, of course, at UNESCO. Some of these issues are also informed by the various reports that are done by people such as the special mandate holders, or what we call them special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, on privacy issues, reports from the OSCE, from Council of Europe, from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the African Commission on Humans and People's Rights. Various commissions have also issued regional guidelines and regional standards. So first off, freedom of the media. That's the slide that I'll put up. There are only 4 slides in my presentation. UNESCO has noted profound transformation in the field of media freedom, which is making certain progress in some areas, but not so much in other areas. In particular, legal reform has not been progressing as much as we hope that it will be, especially in regards to guarantees to access, to seek and to receive information. They are increasing incursion into privacy issues and also expansion of mass and arbitrary surveillance. These are often seen as threats to journalistic sources, to journalist sources' protection in particular, and to public confidence into privacy issues. And privacy, journalism sources, these are some of the issues and some of the key ingredients that the UN has already agreed that they are quite very important to freedom of expression. And as Indria has already noted, that even when regulations are in place for data protections and privacy issues, for example, in Indonesia, they are actually more on technical policy rather than actual laws that would protect the rights of it. There are also a lot of evidence of large-scale internet shutdowns and censorships and just simply turning off the internet. Most recently in Turkey, for example, that had happened. And the Human Rights Council in 2016 has already unequivocally condemned such policy and such practice by any countries, because the restrictions of the access to the internet is a restriction to the freedom of expression, both to seek and to receive information. In fact, the condemnations put it this way: it says, unequivocally condemns the measure to intentionally prevent and disrupt access or to dissemination of information online. Furthermore, a majority of all these legal reforms pertaining to the press have continued to be regressive. And in most countries, even when the constitutional guarantees are there, the laws have not kept up. Azmi Sharum's example of the Sedition Act and the Official Secret Act are very good examples of these kind of cases. In another area, criminal defamation. Criminal defamation is an area which is quite problematic. According to our data, we don't actually keep this data in a regular, systematic fashion. In fact, data on defamation has been hard to get nowadays. But at least 130 member states still have defamation as a criminal offense. And these include actually Malaysia, Indonesia, and I believe in India is also criminal defamation. And to be very, very sure, the UN position, including UNESCO's position, and we do put this up as our official recommendation for the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR process, is to decriminalize all defamation charges and put them under the civil code. Relatedly, violent extremism is also an issue which has been brought up, and these are also brought up as part of the spread of the use of social media, and they have been used by governments to use them as a blanket justification on censorship and to block certain access to certain information. The special rapporteurs, as I have mentioned just now, in 2016 also issued a joint declaration to say that governments cannot use extremism as a way to fight extremism, to put a blanket ban on information and to access certain sites. Next, I want to talk about media pluralism. Pluralism on the media side has seen an increase. For example, Wikipedia has seen, since 2012, double its number of pages and articles written. There has also been an increase of information online that are that's not just in the main languages, especially in English. And the rise of the mobile technology is definitely one of those contributors. Indria's example of the rise of social media, WhatsApp, and also Soares in India is an indication of the rise of and the increase of access to the internet via social media and via mobile technology. The internet concentration of the media, though, is still a problem. Concentration of the media is a problem because it restricts the variety of information. Certain owners will never be agreeable to certain content, and hence the limitations of content variety if ownerships are concentrated into the hands of the few. Something that Soares also mentioned, which I thought was quite interesting, was the increase of social media, but at the same time, there's this increase of echo chambers and filter bubbles. These are not a very good development for freedom of expression and the diversity and the plurality of the media, because everybody seems to be falling into these silos, and they are just accessing information that are only interesting to themselves. And here we are at IFLA, we would encourage a diversity of media. So what can we do when we are faced with people increasing appetite for the same kind of information that they have been consuming all the time? So more junk and more junk, more of the same, more of the same. So what are our roles in trying to diversify that? That is a question that can be debated. The term fake news is also something that is related to all this echo chamber issue. I'm not personally in favor of the phrase fake news. If it's fake, it's not news. If it's news, it's not fake. As simple as that. And I always thought that journalists and librarians are the original fact checkers. We provide the actual correct information to the public who seeks them. So that is something that I think we need to reinvigorate that role to make sure that public gets the best quality information, correct information as far as possible. There is another practice on the internet that is, or by internet intermediaries, especially such as Facebook. It's called the zero rating, and it's sort of cap it, your data plan. So whenever you scroll through your phone and you look at all the screens and like videos that's just popping up on your feed on Facebook, it doesn't count towards your data cap. And that is actually bad for this phenomenon on fake news. It's free, it doesn't count towards your data plan, but it's bad because what happens is that if you click on it, it counts on your data plan. And how do you verify something if you don't click on it? You can only verify something if you click on it, and you click on it, and you click on the next link, and you go and search for the actual information. But because the users know that if you just simply scroll through the news feed, it will not count into your data plan. They are happy to simply just scroll through it and not go deeper. And only by going deeper can we counter a little bit of this fake news and hoax phenomenon. So that is something that we need to keep in mind as well. One factor that I want to add as well concerning pluralism is actually the lack of women in media content. This has been ongoing. I mean, it is nothing new. We have heard the argument again and again, but just to throw it out as well, only 1 in 4 decision makers in the media are women. Only 1 in 3 reporters is a woman. And only 1 in 5 experts interviewed on the TV, on the radio, on the television, on the newspapers is a woman. So I think we can work a bit better to increase that ratio from 1 in 5 to perhaps 2 or 3 in 5. So that is something achievable and can be done. In terms of media independence, good and bad as well. Good is that there is a stronger recognition on the role of self-regulation of the media. In Soares Paul's last point is that something about the government, we should do what we can to avoid the government interfering. And self-regulation of the media is something that can be used to assist in that matter. Self-regulation of the media is media being regulated by members of the media themselves. The most common modality around the world has been the press council modality. And that is something that can be used, but there are other mechanisms as well. The journalists have also a code of ethics. We are thinking of the possibility of social media users having their own code of ethics. Some would say Facebook's community standards is a sort of code of ethics, but that in itself is a lot of problem. And somehow Facebook seems to be veering towards a lot of legal protections, legal way of interpreting the community standards rather than a code of ethics per se. So that by itself is also problematic. I want to skip ahead a little bit, so we will have some time to talk about the last point, which is safety of journalists. Safety of journalists is something that is directly pertinent to the issue of freedom of expression. If a journalist cannot do his or her work in peace and knowing that he or she will not be persecuted and in fact killed in the most extreme of cases, it is not helpful for freedom of expression. The Asia Pacific, well, actually just globally, the cases of killed journalists has been increasing. You see the figure 530, that is only between 2012 to 2016. UNESCO actually releases a report every 2 years, and we have been compiling that report since 2006. And since 2006, we have documented almost 1,000 cases of journalists killed. That is, on average, 2 killed journalists per week. And why do we think that is a big deal? Well, you see numbers ranging to the thousands in war zones. But we have to remember, 1 journalist contributes to the entire society. So if the most visible member of a society is targeted for being the messenger, he's not even the original person who is delivering the message. He is delivering the message on behalf of another person, reporting what he or she sees and hear. And to kill that messenger sends a very, very bad message, and it increases what is always called as the climate of fear. And to make things worse, only 1 in 10 cases are ever investigated fully, which means at any one time, 9 killers are out there free and maybe trying to kill another journalist. So that is a very dire condition. Just now we were saying that women are not favorably treated in the media, and perhaps the only area that in this report on the world trends on freedom of expression and media development is that women are the minority when it comes to journalists being killed. okay? But that is not a great honor, I imagine. Is still deaf. And on top of that, journalists, women journalists, face an additional layer of harassment, usually of sexual nature, and especially if the women journalists dare to be talking about technology and sports. So that is an issue that is on the rise, and we can see because probably due to the Me Too campaign as well around the world, that more journalists are more vocal, female journalists are more vocal about the harassment that they have faced throughout their career. Indonesia's Independent Journalists Associations, as well as Malaysia's Independent Journalists Association, issued a statement recently about their stance against sexual harassment of journalists, female journalists, especially in doing their job. So hopefully this will continue to raise more awareness on these particular issues, and we will ensure that no matter if it's female or male journalist, he or she can do his or her work without fear of being killed, without fear of being harassed, and we will all be better off because of that. So in summary, globally, the trend has been very mixed. The bright spots are few and far between, but we are here to continue to work. And one of the areas that I think is showing some degree of promise is a media and information literacy, capacity building and policy work. It was mentioned as perhaps one of the ways to tackle and counter the issue of hate speech, the issue of fake news. And in the previous session that I attended this today, I believe that the Malaysian National Library actually has been doing information literacy workshop to rural community. And those kind of activities we will really encourage to be expanded and to be continued and to increase to include newer elements of the information society as we know it nowadays. And we would really love to work with any one of you that actually has that kind of program to help it expand or to help it get some more legs. And with that, I turn the floor back to Mr. Moderator. Thank you very much.
I'm actually going to remain sitting here for the next section. But before we move on to the question and answer session, can I ask you to express your appreciation again for the 4 terrific speakers who I think have given us a real insight into the issues in Southeast Asia. And I have to say, they chime with issues, I think, right around the world in their own way. I actually wanted to start with a question that we've received online, and it was aimed at ASME, but if I hope that the individual who sent it in will not mind me slightly adapting the question, simply to broaden it and ask all our speakers today, please send another question in if you don't like my response. But the question was, is it necessary for the government or authority to ban books that they think are not suitable for Malaysian people? But I wonder if we could expand that to any government or authority to ban books or websites which they do not think are suitable for the country that they're responsible for. So, Asmi, I'd perhaps like you to start with that, as the question was originally aimed at you, but I think it's something that reflects a lot of the topics covered this afternoon, and it'd be good, I think, to have the responses of all our speakers.
Well, the short answer is, of course not. But I think I'm more sympathetic to the European, British approach, as opposed to the American approach, which, you know, you can say anything, or, you know, there's a much more freedom of expression. Whereas, for example, hate crime and hate speech is not allowed in certain places. The problem is that if you're going to do that, you're going to have to be very specific as to what you mean in order to ensure that if anything is banned or blocked, it has to be done within a very narrow confines. And this also has to be done with the higher aspiration that freedom of speech ultimately is a good thing. So if you don't have these two elements, a high aspiration and also a very narrow ban as to what can or cannot, what can be banned, I would say incitement to violence, for example. I've got no problems with banning any statement which incites people to violence. But we don't have that, and that's a problem. And if you look at the list of books which are banned by Malaysia, it's really about having a different opinion from what the government wants you to have. The fact that they banned so many books in Malay is extremely worrying because it was an attempt to control the Malay mind. And that is obviously there's a political reason behind that.
Who would like to pick that up next?
Hi, thanks. Just to add on to what Azmi has already said, whenever we try to limit freedom of expression, they should be as narrowly as possible, very specific. In fact, there is what they call a three-part test, whether it is proportional, whether it's prescribed by law, whether it is actually whether it is actually necessary. So if it's not even necessary to begin with, perhaps the best way is to use other ways to counter it. And I really like what Azmi have said about it should be about reaching higher aspiration. Banning a book, any publications, in fact, should be the hard decision. It's not the easy way out. You are banning anything because it is sort of the last resort. There are very clear-cut exceptions, naturally. Child pornography, incitement to violence, those are those are out of most protections. But it is really to reach that higher aim that ultimately more freedom of expression can be achieved. Whenever we talk about freedom of expression, the more protection, the better. Whenever we talk about limitation, the least, more narrow version is the best. Thanks.
If I could just add to that, I also agree. I like the framing of it as a higher aspiration, and perhaps we could think of it as tying in with the right to life and liberty as well as the right to equality. But I would also like to add in that even when banning is the hard option, there still could be other options, such as nudging people. If you really think it's going to incite violence, let's say, which I think on its own is always a difficult claim because there are several factors, causal factors, which go into incitement of violence, and I would think it's difficult to prove that a particular text is causing that violence as opposed to, let's say, this person's upbringing or any other number of factors. So even when you do use those reasons, I would think, I actually don't know if other jurisdictions do this. India doesn't, but as an idea, just an idea off the top of my mind right now, nudging people away from reading that without actually banning it. Let's say the book is available in public libraries on a checkout basis, but it's not encouraged to be sold otherwise, or similar measures like that, where it is available, but you have to take a little larger step to actually get that book. This is only in those hard situations where the other alternative is banning it altogether.
Maybe a little addition to that is, I do agree with the idea of stringence, the standard to ban the book, because of course we do not want it, but the reality is many governments, especially in ASEAN countries, still retain their power to do so because of, for example, the national threat and any idea about national security, which is always put into debate about the limit of that and how they interpret what's so-called national security and public morale, like in the case of Indonesia. So to always promote a more stringent standard, a more limited and exhaustive list of violations that can be considered and can justify the action to ban particular publications produced in that particular country is always, I think, feasible. And that's also the things that in Indonesian society try to do. Because previously we also experienced what the Malaysians have, but since 1998, then we move into the idea that any book banning need to be justified by the court, and there was a constitutional challenge based on the human rights law, and then they revoked the power of the Attorney General to do so. But we are facing a different threat now, which maybe also might occur in other ASEAN countries, is the attempt to criminalize those who are writing that based on the different accusations, like falsifying the fact to the public. It happened in Indonesia recently with the publications related to the president of Indonesia, Jokowi. Of course, public knows that things that were written in that book was totally wrong, but actually it shouldn't give any justifications. And because the government cannot ban the book, then the police move into that case and then try to go further into a criminal investigations and then send the person that wrote the book into prisons. So this can be also another threat that might be experienced by other Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? There were two hands up immediately. There's a gentleman with a red t-shirt, if you come first to the microphone, and then a lady just by the microphone as well. So if you can come second.
Good afternoon. Elzo Lawrence from University of the Nottingham. My question goes to Dr. Azmi Sharom. I have two questions for you. The first one, do you think that Malaysia is a religious, secular, or biased country? And the second one is, Malaysia, is it true that Malaysia is not a signatory to the International Covenant and Political Rights, ICCPR, which means that it does not recognize Article 19 of the Covenant, which addresses the right to freedom of expression? Thank you.
Okay, my point of view, it's Malaysia is secular, all right? Article 3 says that Islam is a religion of the federation. It doesn't mean that it is an Islamic state, right? Because Article 4 says that the Constitution is the supreme law, not the Quran, the Constitution. You have historical documents showing that when Article 3 was inserted into the Constitution, the political powers at that time, which is UMNO, MCA, and MIC, clearly stated this does not mean that the Constitution is not secular. We have documents showing this. We have court cases saying that the country is secular. The Article 3 does not make it an Islamic state. In the case of Cik Omar Cik Noh, the guy in question was sentenced to death for drug trafficking, and he said, no, I'm a Muslim, I should be under Islamic law, and Islamic law, there is no such thing as death for drug trafficking. And the judge says, no, that's not the way it is. The country is not like that. Okay, but there are people in this country who say, no, we are an Islamic state, Article 3, etc. They're wrong. I was going to say something ruder, but they're just wrong. And I say this 100 million times. If you want to make this country an Islamic state, fine. Campaign for it, win enough seats, get a constitutional amendment, or change the constitution altogether. But don't make it an Islamic state through the back door. That is dishonest, which I would have thought is un-Islamic, but I don't know. The second question is the convention. Yes, of course. What it means is that it's harder for us to impose higher international standards onto the country. Because we do have Article 10 in the Constitution. It does say that we respect freedom of expression. But it's harder for us to judge the government with regards to a higher standard. Courts have been very clear on this. Unless we are actually party to a convention, they're not going to use the standards of a convention we are not party to, right? So it would be helpful. Now, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Saifuddin Abdullah, has said that they want to ratify a whole bunch of human rights treaties. So that is something that we have to keep an eye out for.
Thank you. The lady next to the microphone.
Yes. Elizabeth. I'm from the National Library of Sweden, and I like to change a little bit the subject. My question is not really a question, or it's more like if you could give me some opinions of hatred and threat. In Sweden, we have done some research, and we can see that women and men are threatened through internet quite a lot. The men are mostly abused or made comments concerning their skills, their professional skills, and the women usually get sexual harassments and sexual threats. And we have also seen that 1 out of 3 authors or artists have got threats, or their artworks has been destroyed or vandalized. And this is a potential threat to the libraries in the long run, because of if the authors are always threatened or subject to hate and threats, it's going to be like a self-censorship. And that is, in the long run, going to threaten the freedom of speech. So what could we do to avoid this situation? How could we stop this trend and make it safe again to be an author, for instance, or a cultural worker or an artist? I'd like to hear your opinions of that. Thank you.
I can offer something that in the NGO called Media Diversity Institute have developed. It's called How to Fight the Trolls. And one of the suggestions includes getting people, like-minded people, to counter, and I'm talking about social media right now. So to counter the message of on the social media. For example, if a group of people are using the social media to really promote hate and violence and nasty things against a certain author, there is power in group, power in a large group where people get together and try to change the conversations and try to overpower the nastiness with something more positive and to show solidarity. So that is one of the ways that they have recommended. Changing the meaning of the hashtag is, taking over a certain hashtag is also one of the ways to get the crowd to go in. It can be helpful in certain cases. They have seen it work in certain cases. So that is one way to deal with it if the case is happening on the social media.
I hope this contributes to an answer. Again, so going back to the business models of social media companies, if, for example, you go to YouTube, and whatever the topic is, you keep autoplay on. If you are slightly center of right, soon enough you'll be in Nazi land. If you're slightly center of left, soon enough you'll be on the other extreme. If you search for something on jogging, soon enough you'll be how to run an ultramarathon. So I think this is a problem that social media not just allows, but encourages. It pushes people towards extremist views of whatever topic it is. And again, this goes back to what I was talking earlier about the attention economy. things of this nature tend to grab people's attention more, and they stay on for that. So just to try to turn this around and answer your question, I think there is some responsibility that perhaps these social media companies can be held to. Maybe a better reporting mechanism, because the current ones are clearly not working. For example, the Facebook guidelines on content moderation, they're very interesting. There's a specific question that says, should content abusing white men be taken down, or should content abusing black children be taken down? And the answer to this is content abusing white men, not black children. And the reason for this is children acts, according to Facebook, children acts as a qualifier which does not generalize, which generalizes it beyond a specific identity, a protected identity. Now, of course, everyone knows that which are the more marginalized groups of these two. So if an algorithm protects or accepts complaints about abuse of one of these categories, it's very clear to everyone in this room which of those categories it should be. But social media companies need to start tweaking the algorithms, need to draw hard lines on what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. And these algorithms and decisions that need to continuously be updated. How exactly they'll do that, I don't have an answer for right now.
Sorry, I just want to add to that. They have actually changed that now because of all the problematic imagination, not just imagination, but the very public outcry against that particular line. And that is what I was saying just now earlier, because they have gone to a very legalistic way of doing content moderation on Facebook. Back in the days, and I'm talking about 2008 there, the content moderation community standard of Facebook is literally 1 page. And right now it's over 200 pages. So it had gotten very, very thick and gotten very, very legalistic. And they rely heavily on the policies and the customs and the legal decisions in the American courts. So, but that particular one has been removed.
We are running a little bit over time, but we've had one more online question, which I think would be nice if you can to pick up with. But although it's a broad question, but if we can keep answers fairly concise, it says, can we explore further the role and responsibility of governments vis-a-vis intermediaries in promoting freedom of information and expression?
It's definitely a very difficult question. I mean, in a sense, like, how could we actually strike the balance of the role of the government, whether or not actually, for example, because in some other regions, under the principle of net neutrality, those who are providing services should not be burdened by controlling the information that flow over their top, you know. But then, I think with the scandal of like Facebook that recently we are facing, then people start to think about that principles and see that actually, to a certain extent, it's simply because the awareness that the platform has more power in some cases to create rules and to limit and to prevent the harmful that come up from that. So to that extent, then maybe the idea of intermediary liability makes sense. But then when it comes to that, it prone the service provider into criminal liability, that's another issue that need to be, and still need a long discussions on that. That's my.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it depends on where you are, the context of your country, because what we're seeing in Malaysia now is that a government is more sympathetic towards the freedom of expression because it's a new government and because this is what the people want. Whereas before, they just totally ignored the whole concept because they were in power and they felt they were never, ever going to lose power. right? So in that sense, I think it ought to be, and it can only be very people-driven. If your government don't care or doesn't believe in human rights, then there's nothing, then what are we going to do? But we can force the change. Secondly, yes, I think with regards to promoting it, the less they do with regards to freedom of expression, the less rules we have, the better. But for freedom of information, there has to be a very proactive action taken by the government to lay down the specific rules and as broad as possible, whereas while still protecting state secrets, etc. That is something which is a lot more technical. We have to be a bit more active about it. Right now, in Malaysia, you feel that there's more freedom of expression. The laws are still there. It's just that so far, most of it's not being enforced. But the laws are still there, and that's very dangerous. We've got to get rid of them.
Okay. Thank you. As I say, we have run a little bit over time, for which I apologize. But thank you all for staying in such a well-air-conditioned hall. I hope you've enjoyed a very, very thought-provoking afternoon, and can you join me with expressing our appreciation again to 4 very well-informed and excellent speakers. Thank you very much. And thank you to those who've been listening on live streaming, and as I said, this whole session will be, the recording of this whole session will be available shortly on the IFLA website for those of you who'd like to listen to it again, or perhaps also share it with your colleagues. Thank you.